Okay, so welcome to the dpanel tutorial on the podcast module. To add an episode to a podcast, we go here and we can just simply click the Add Episode button. So this takes us straight through to the view to add an episode to any podcast on the site. So obviously you need to go to your website /dpanel and log in there, and then we get this view. So here on this site you can see we have two podcast options available. The name field is the name of the podcast episode that we're creating, and the date is the date on which we want this to be published. So in order to arrange a podcast in a particular order, they have to be arranged in date order. So if you're going to output this to iTunes, it's done automatically, and it's done automatically on the site as well, in that whichever podcast is earliest is put first. So in here, let's just put the author name. So here we go, and the description is optional, but is slightly nice to have, particularly if your site makes use of this elsewhere as well. Down below this we have keywords and a link. These aren't necessarily needed. Keywords can just be handy for people to try and find your podcast, particularly if this episode is about something different to what the rest of your podcast is about. And a link here which can take people through to a specific part of the website. If you push your podcast to the iTunes store, you get a link tab that people can click on to go back to your website. And this little select here is set by default to no. You can also set it to clean or to yes. It's quite important that it's set to one of these three. If it is explicit, set it to yes, or your podcast may well be kicked out of the iTunes store. If you're not podcasting to iTunes, none of these three particularly matter. So the image gives us the option to add an image to the episode of the podcast, and if we go to social media here, then we can add in one of the images that we use. This is a custom field for this site, but down below we have a few more options. So file location gives us a few options here, so we can either upload the file through the dpanel. Now this is fine if you're going to have relatively small levels of downloads and you're not going to be putting any significant level of strain on the server. But we do recommend that you host the files externally, and in this case it asks you for an external file URL. So we use Dropbox, and if you go in the public folder of Dropbox, and if we go onto one of these, then you can hover over and get copy public link. If you copy this link to the clipboard, it says copied there, and go over to the add episode, paste it in that box, and as you can see, that is now in there. Now the only problem with this is that the dpanel can't automatically detect the file size and duration, and these are required fields because of the way that browsers handle file downloading. So in order to get these, you need to write down the size and duration of these files before you upload them. So one way to do that in Mac OS is to select the file, and if you hit Command I, then it brings up the information dialog. And down here under more info, we have the duration. The duration of this song is 6 minutes and 1 second. And we just need the file size. So for the file size, you have 12.1 megabytes or this longer number of bytes, and it's this longer number that you need to take. You can copy that and paste that directly into this field, and it'll strip out all the commas for you. So now we've set our file location, the file size, and the duration. The image, which is used on the site itself, and various other information. The active checkbox allows us to define whether or not the podcast episode that we're working on here will actually appear online, so it's possible to create a podcast and wait a few days before actually pushing it out to iTunes and out to the website. The other thing to remember is that this image here will not pull through as the album artwork for iTunes. That has to be set through iTunes itself, so you need to open up the MP3 file or whichever file format you're using in iTunes and select album art and set your album art from there. You can also do various other things through that. We recommend setting comments, so if you put your description also in the comments tag, and if you include it in the lyrics tag as well, that will appear on iPhones and iPod touches when you touch the screen while a podcast is playing, if that's something you're interested in, and if you're going through iTunes. So that is how you add a podcast. You can then apply, which will save your changes and leave you on the screen, save changes to save your changes and take you away from the screen, or reset to clear all the fields. If we then go through to the main view of the podcast module, you can see your two podcasts. To edit the episodes of a podcast, you actually have to click on this number here. The edit field takes us through to a different view, which allows us to alter the fields that are related to this podcast. So we have the podcast name, a short description, an image, and various other information. Now, a lot of this information is used by iTunes, and there's more information on this in the dpanel help section. And for these fields over here, which is iTunes specific, you've got a link here to Apple's help documentation. So when you go through to the episodes, you can see all the episodes, and similar to the site content module, you've got an edit and a delete button. Delete button will prompt you as to whether or not you want to delete that episode. The edit button takes you back through to that edit view that we were first on, and the active button allows you to choose whether or not that file should be currently available from the service, whether or not that episode is currently in the podcast. So that is the dpanel podcast module.